He had spent over 20 years in service, and in all that time, Colonel Arjun Singh Rathore had never once felt a tremor in his hand while raising a salute. From the blistering cold of Siachen to the dust-choked fields of Rajasthan, his fingers had met his brow with the same crisp, mechanical precision. But today, standing on the immaculate gravel of the Rajpath, with the January chill biting at his cheeks, he felt a strange tightness in his chest. It was the final rehearsal for the Republic Day Parade. As the senior-most officer commanding the ceremonial battalion, his role was one of rigid protocol. He was a human metronome, ensuring every boot fell in unison, every rifle swung as one. His men, a hand-picked company of the Royal Guard, moved like extensions of his own will. They were not just soldiers. They were the living embodiment of the nation's discipline, their scarlet tunics and gleaming bayonets a spectacle of pride. The sun, as a pale disk struggling to pierce the winter haze, cast long shadows. Colonel Rathore took his position, his spine a rod of steel. The parade was a symphony of silence, broken only by the sharp bark of commands and the rhythmic crunch of boots. His voice, honed by decades of drill, cut through the air. Sawaya! Sajad! Vishram! His eyes, shielded by the peak of his service cap, scanned the ranks. He looked for the smallest flaw, a shoulder out of line by a millimeter, a gaze that wavered. And he found none. These men were perfection. Yet, as he prepared to give the final command before the mock salute to the chief guest, he felt a peculiar urge. Protocol dictated a standard salute from the commandant. But today, he wanted to do something different. He wanted to honor them. He drew a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. Guard! Battalion! Saja! 200 rifles snapped to their shoulders in a single, thunderous motion. The Colonel Rathore then performed a crisp about-turn, facing his men. He drew his sword, the polished steel flashing in the weak sunlight. He raised it slowly, deliberately, bringing the hilt to his lips in the traditional sword salute, a gesture reserved for the highest-ranking officials or as a mark of supreme respect. He was saluting them, not as subordinates, but as the guardians of the Republic. For a moment, there was a profound, almost deafening silence, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Rathore held the salute, his eyes meeting the unwavering stares of the front row. He expected nothing in return but their disciplined stillness. That was the protocol. Then it happened. It started as a soft, almost imperceptible rumble from the center of the formation. It wasn't a command. It wasn't planned. It was a wave of pure, spontaneous human emotion. The rumble grew into a synchronized stamping of boots, a resonant thud-thud-thud that vibrated up through the gravel and into the colonel's very bones. It was the Guard's highest accolade, a battle honor usually reserved for fallen comrades or moments of incredible valor. It was a thunderous applause, a roar from the heart of the battalion. Colonel Rathore's hand, still holding the salute, trembled. Not from the cold. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to push against his chest. He saw a young soldier in the third row, and his jaw clenched tight, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on his cheek. Another, a veteran with a row of metal ribbons, stared straight ahead, but his lips were pressed into a thin white line, fighting back a swell of emotion. The stamping continued for a full 30 seconds, an eternity in the rigid world of military ceremony. It was a conversation, a dialogue of respect spoken not in words, but in the very language of their service. The colonel finally lowered his sword, his arm aching slightly from the prolonged salute. He sheathed it with a soft click, the sound barely audible over the fading echo of the boots. He then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a nod of acknowledgement, a nod of thanks, a nod that said, "I see you. I am one of you." The men held their formation, immobile once more, but the air between them had changed. It was charged with a new, powerful current of mutual respect that no order could ever command. The rehearsal continued. But for Colonel Rathor, the parade was already over. The real ceremony had just taken place. That night, alone in his quarters, Colonel Rathor could still feel the vibration in his feet. He sat in his armchair, the weight of his service revolver on the side table, and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. He saw the graying hair, the deep lines etched by sun and wind. He saw a man who had commanded troops in battle, who had led men through hell and back. But he also saw a man who had been humbled. He thought of his own father, also a soldier who had taught him that a leader eats last, sleeps last, and asks for nothing in return. He had lived by that code, but he had never expected this. He had never expected his gesture of respect to be mirrored back with such overwhelming force. He remembered the face of the young soldier with the tear. That boy, barely out of his teens, carrying the weight of a rifle and the honor of a nation. What was he thinking? Was he thinking of his own family watching the parade on a small television in a distant village? Was he thinking of the friends he had lost in a silent skirmish in the mountains? The colonel's mind drifted to the veteran with the medal ribbons. He knew those ribbons. One was for a campaign in the high-altitude wasteland of the northern glacier. The man had probably seen things no human should see, had lost friends to avalanches and enemy fire. Now, for him to be moved to the point of silence, it meant something deeper. It was an acknowledgement of a shared burden, a recognition that the colonel understood the cost of those ribbons. Sleep did not come easily. The thunderous stamp of boots played on a loop in his mind. He got up and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet cantonment. The lights were off in the barracks, his men asleep. He thought about the unspoken bond between an officer and his men. It was a fragile thing. It built on trust and tested by fire. He had always believed it was his duty to protect that bond. But tonight he realized it was the bond that protected him. He thought about the salute. It was a simple act, a piece of choreography. But in that moment, it had become a sacrament. He had offered a piece of his own respect, his own acknowledgement of their sacrifice. And they had responded by showing him that they understood. They understood that behind the rank and the medals, he was just a man, and a soldier like them, bound by the same oath, facing the same fears. Dawn broke cold and clear. It was the day of the actual parade. The air hummed with a different kind of energy, a raw electric tension. Millions of eyes would be watching. The fate of nations wasn't in the balance, but the reputation of the regiment was. And for Colonel Rathor, that was everything. He dressed with even more care than usual. The wool of his tunic felt heavier, and the polished brass buttons seemed to gleam with a sharper light. As he pinned on his medals, his fingers paused on a particular one, a gallantry award from a counterinsurgency operation in the dense forests of the Northeast. He remembered that day, the chaos, the screams, the face of a young soldier he had pulled to safety. That soldier, now a captain, was standing in the ranks today. The drive to the assembly point was quiet. His adjutant, a bright young major, sat beside him, reviewing the final checklist. But Colonel Rathor wasn't listening. He was looking out at the streets lined with people, the families already staking their spots, the children waving tiny flags. This was what they were protecting. This chaotic, vibrant, hopeful crowd. When he arrived at the battalion staging area, the men were already formed up. They were a wall of scarlet and black, their bayonets glinting like a frozen river. As he walked along the ranks for a final inspection, and he looked each man in the eye. He didn't see nameless faces in a formation anymore. He saw the young, tearful soldier, his eyes now bright with fierce pride. He saw the veteran, his gaze steady as a rock. He saw the captain he had once saved standing tall in the front. He stopped in front of a young man, a Lance Naik from a small village in Uttarakhand. The boy's boots were polished to a mirror shine. The colonel noticed a small, hand-stitched good luck charm tied to his inner webbing. He nodded at it. "From your mother?" The Lance Naik's eyes widened slightly, surprised the colonel had spoken to him. "Yes, sir," he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "Good," the colonel said, his voice low enough for only the boy to hear. "She'll be watching. Make her proud." He continued his walk, the silence now filled with a palpable sense of unity. He didn't need to give a rousing speech. The moment had already passed. The rehearsal had been their speech. Today was just the public declaration. The massed bands struck up a stirring march, the rumble of heavy trucks and missile carriers preceded them. And then it was their turn. Colonel Rathore drew his sword, the blade flashing in the bright sun. He felt the weight of history, the weight of his men, the weight of a nation's hope on his shoulders. He gave the command, his voice carrying with a clarity that surprised even himself. The Royal Guard moved as one. 200 men, a single entity of disciplined motion. Their boots hit the tarmac in perfect unison, the sound a deep, rolling thunder that was swallowed by the vastness of Rajpath. They passed the reviewing dais, heads turning in perfect synchronization. Colonel Rathore performed his sword salute to the president, his movements flawless, his back ramrod straight. But as he passed the point where the dignitaries sat, he stole a glance at his own men. They were magnificent, a river of pride and steel. And in that moment, he knew that the real salute, the one that mattered, had already been given and received 3 days ago, in the quiet chill of a winter morning, under the watchful eyes of no one but themselves. The parade ended, the formations dispersed. The crowds began to thin, a human tide receding from the banks of the Rajpath. Colonel Rathore stood apart from the jubilant chaos, watching his men being congratulated by family members who had managed to get passes. Then he saw the Lance Naik with the good luck charm being hugged by a tiny gray-haired woman in a simple sari. The boy was grinning from ear to ear, a different person from the stoic statue of an hour ago. He felt a tap on his shoulder. It was the veteran with the metal ribbons, now out of uniform and wearing a simple kurta. He stood there, not quite at attention, but with a dignity that needed no rank. He extended his hand. "Sir," he said, his voice gruff. Colonel Rathore took it. The grip was firm, calloused, honest. "Subedar," the colonel acknowledged, using his former rank. The veteran held on for a moment longer than necessary. "What you did at the rehearsal, sir," he said, his eyes looking somewhere past the colonel, into the middle distance. That was for all of us, for the ones who couldn't be here today." He cleared his throat, a rough sound. "Jai Hind, sir." He let go, turned, and walked away, merging into the crowd. Colonel Rathore watched him go, a lump forming in his own throat. He understood. The veteran wasn't just talking about the soldiers who had died. He was talking about the parts of themselves they all left behind on the battlefield, the innocence, the carefree joy, the parts that could never come back. The colonel's salute had been an acknowledgement of that loss, a validation of the invisible wounds they all carried. Later that evening, the regiment held a small, informal gathering. There was tea and snacks, and a far cry from the official receptions. The men were relaxed, laughing, showing photos of their families. Colonel Rathore stood by a pillar, nursing a cup of chai, observing. He was the senior officer, and there was an invisible barrier, a line they would not cross without permission. Then, the young Lance Naik from Uttarakhand, emboldened by the festive atmosphere and perhaps a nudge from his friends, walked up to him. He held out his phone, a shy smile on his face. On the screen was a paused video. "Sir," he stammered, "my mother, she recorded the parade on the television. She..." She wants to know if she can get a photo of you with me. For the village. Colonel Rathor looked at the boy, then at the phone, then back at the cluster of nervous young soldiers watching from a distance. He saw their hope, their hero worship. He saw his own younger self in them. He smiled. A genuine, warm smile that seemed to surprise even himself. Of course. Lance Nake, he said, but only if you promise to send a copy to my wife. She keeps complaining I don't feature in enough photos. The tension broke. The young soldiers laughed, a release of nervous energy. The Lance Nake beamed, positioning himself next to the colonel, holding his phone up for a selfie. As the flash went off, Colonel Rathor felt a profound sense of peace. The thunderous stamp of boots from the rehearsal had faded, replaced by the quiet, simple joy of a shared moment. He knew that in a few months he would be retiring. The thought, once a source of quiet dread, now felt natural. He had spent his life building walls of discipline and protocol. But in the end, it wasn't a wall that defined his career. It was a bridge built in a single silent moment on a cold rehearsal morning, when he had chosen to salute his men and they had saluted him right back. And on that bridge, spanning the divide of rank and experience, they had met as brothers,